finish off Bible problems this session. And in the third session, I warned you, is the time for Q&A. Anything you want to ask me about that I covered this week or didn't cover this week but you wished I had. Anything to do with the intersection of God, philosophy, and science, theology, whatever, you can ask me in the third session. If you don't have questions, then I can always say a little bit about the science. Some of the science stuff which will be new, which I'm pretty sure we're not covered, even though you've got a lot of science. But because you had a lot of science, that went on to the back burner, and we're doing other stuff instead. So let's look at the destruction of the Canaanites. And this is going to be pretty fast for you because we've already half there yesterday in our discussion. But for any society, the net moral value of that society at time t is the sum of the moral values of all the primary events at t and their consequences from time t into the future to the end of history. So that would sum to E. Minus the same thing, F, but for the deletion of that culture and all the consequences, different set of consequences that stem from not allowing that event to occur. So that's E and F. So the net moral value of any society is E minus F. Does that make sense? Basically, think of it as a scales. What are the consequences of allowing this society to continue, and what are all the consequences to the end of history of not allowing it to continue? And does it weigh this way or that way? If it weighs this way, we better terminate the society. If it weighs this way, you better protect that society. So that's the main idea. So if you were to graph this out, now keep in mind I will stretch your minds once or twice from time to time in this week. And this is one of those points. But when you look at it that way, when you look at it's a set of skills, and God knows whether it's better or not better to allow things to occur. That applies not just to individual events, it entires to entire civilizations and societies. Now, I'm not just making this up. I think I might have mentioned to you that I got an invitation to present a paper at a philosophy conference at Leeds in the UK. And it was because I'd published some papers on the problem of evil and stuff. So I thought, oh man, that doesn't mean I'll actually give a paper. You have to submit your idea and then they'll decide. So I thought, well, it'd be nice for have a vacation, and some friends of ours gave us a stack of cash to just blow. They said, I don't want you anything to show for this. No buying furniture, no pay down the car. You blow it. And on a vacation or something. So we went to the UK, rented a car, and we had a great time for about a couple of weeks. And I thought, well, I'll run an idea by them. I'm going to argue that God sometimes must destroy entire civilizations. And here's a couple of reasons that I gave them. And I figured if they go for this, well, I'm in for sure. And they did. And so I gave that paper there. And it really survived well in that you give your paper, then the Q&A, and you got these philosophers all over the world who don't necessarily like the idea that God must destroy civilization, so they're asking hard questions. And at the end of it, I got a few emails several months later from the editor of Cambridge University's Journal for the Philosophy of Religion. It's called Religious Studies. And he said he had been at that conference. I don't think he was there. There was another editor. There was 3 editors, and I know one of them was in my presentation. I didn't think she was very happy with my paper. And then there was another one. Anyways, I got an email saying, would you be willing to do this paper in the form of an academic paper for publication in our journal? That never happens in the academic world. You have, it's out of maybe 1,000 papers submitted, you might get maybe 80 accepted out of that, maybe even less. But anyways, I wrote it, it was reviewed, and it was published. So I say all this for 2 reasons. Number one, what you're hearing here is not just Kirk Durston losing his mind. Number 2, there's a peer-reviewed academic paper on this. That if you're talking to a prof or somebody who is really highfalutin in they think they're sophisticated or whatever, intellectual, then you can reference that paper. You can get it through my website, free for the downloading. But you'll see here that there could reach a point in the history of a society where they were a net moral value to humanity, but they're deteriorating, and then there's a crossover point, a tipping point, called the termination point. That's when that society, if God does not permit pointless evils to occur that he could not justify, then there reaches a point in a civilization where God can no longer justify protecting or even allowing that civilization to continue. At that point, it's brought to an end, one way or another. So, that's that graph. So, here's an example. Roughly 1800 BC, God is talking to Abraham, and he says this. He says, then in the fourth generation, he says, you can't have this land yet. I'm giving this land to you, but not yet. Not for another 400 years, he says. And then he gives the reason why. In the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. The sin of the people of this land that I'm going to give you someday is not yet at the point where you can have this land, where he's going to wipe them out. And even further, he goes so far as to say, you can't have this land yet. He's actually protecting that culture and that society. Even though there's already bad stuff going on, there's still more good than bad for allowing it to continue. He says, you can't have it. And so here's an illustration of that graph where initially a society might have a net positive, moral positive, if he allows that society to continue, that when you do all the calculations at the end of history, but then there reaches a tipping point, and at that tipping point, God can no longer justify permitting that society to continue. It has to be brought to an end. So around 400 years later, or 1440 BC, so about 400 years later, that they actually enter into the land. You shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with. This is an example. Nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these, the nations all these including all the other stuff he mentioned, which was incest, which was normal, adultery, which was going on rampant. Keep in mind, it's interesting about Rachel the harlot. Normally, a prostitute, later on in Israel was, they're pretty sketchy. Rachel the harlot still has all her family, and she does well enough to have a house on the wall, which is a pretty nice place, and its own roof and stuff, so it's at the top of the wall. And they said, when we come, bring your parents and whatever. So the parents are there as well. She's a wealthy woman, and her parents seem to have a good relationship with her. At least she's got a dad and mom. She's not going into prostitution because she's a single woman with no means of support. No. And so sex in the ancient Canaanite culture was really got out of hand. Sex with animals. Same-sex relations was the other thing he mentioned. It was common and going on. That was the norm. Let's say it was the norm and generally accepted. That kind of stuff always goes on in history. People are always having sex with animals, incest and same-sex relations and adultery. But it's seldom in history where it reaches a point where it's culturally approved and normalized. In our civilization today, it has reached that point, and J.D. Unwin, according to the calculations, we have less than 60 years before a total collapse of the civilization, for all those reasons that some of which we touched on. But anyways, my point here is that 400 years later, the country, they practice these things. He speaks about it as if this is normal. This is what they do in Canaan. This is normalized and fine and accepted, and everybody does it, type of thing. And he says, for that, it's now the tipping point has been reached. Now, I want you to note something here, that it's not just every man, woman, and child is going to be slaughtered. It's only those who remain in the land, and there is a culling process going on ahead of time. He says, I will not drive, he says he's going to drive a lot of the Canaanites of the land before they even get there. In other words, they're not going to get killed, they're going to be driven out through natural things like a plague of hornets, for example. The hornets are just so bad, I'm out of here. Let's move over to Syria or something. They're just terrible here. So he says, I will not drive them out before you in a single year, that the land may not become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. Now that does not happen if just like 10% of the people leave. That does not happen because the other 90% take over their farms and whatever. This happens when you start getting maybe over half, maybe even the majority of people starting to leave and abandon their farms and their vineyards and so forth. When you get the majority of people leaving, there's too much vacant land for the remainder to take over. So there's an implication here, which people often don't notice. It's not just a wholesale annihilation of every man, woman, and child. There's an advanced culling process, and you can be assured that God would be probably, there's certain people that need to be devoted to destruction, people that are just so depraved and evil. And there's others, say a priest of Baal, who's constantly killing little children on a daily basis and burning their bodies. And like, that's so depraved. Maybe they'll be staying behind, but there's lots of decent people. So here's a situation. We saw something like this the other day. But let's imagine that there was other society that could have come about in Canaan. Let's say even Abraham could have been given the land 400 years earlier in that whole different history of the world. But that was not allowed. So that's prevented. And so right off the bat, the future of human history is different from what it would have been had that society X been allowed. So that was prevented. Then the next thing we see is the first settler arrives in Canaan, or the first settler that's going to start the real society there. We don't know who that person was, or that family was, or tribe, but they arrive, and they start having children and multiplying, and next thing you know, there's a village, and next thing you know, they got a society happening there. And so those mushroom into huge consequences. And then Abraham is born in Ur of the Chaldees. Geographically, not even in Canaan, but in the course of his life, he will launch out a series of events that will ultimately affect the Canaanites as well in time. And then we have the Canaanite society destroyed. And so that's that invisible mesh higher up, the destruction of that society. But then there's the other Canaanites who were driven out of Canaan by the hornets and whatever, and they survive, and they start a society somewhere else, or they get mixed and blended in with other societies. So you see, here's the historical situation. Bottom line, this basic premise advanced by atheists that God cannot permit unjustified evil, if we apply that to cultures, then when a culture reaches that crossover point where it becomes a gratuitous evil, or it can no longer be justified, then a perfectly good God would terminate it. That was the summary of my thesis I submitted to the Secular Philosophy Conference. They went for that, and they were, there's a phrase, hoist by their own petard. Hoist by his own petard. I think it's just Shakespearean phrase. Basically, the very premise that atheists embrace is the foundation for this argument, that God cannot permit, or if he cannot justify the continuance of this civilization, then it will be destroyed. Okay, let's go to the next thing. Any questions on that before we go to rape culture? Yes, Nick.
So, are you saying that every time a nation gets over that termination line that God would end it?
Yeah, God would have to, if by his own perfection. That does not, there are some objections that I handled in the paper. It does not therefore logically follow that any, say, group or society that does get ended was therefore evil. It does not follow from that, and we can infer that from the prophecies at the end of human history, where the beast will wage war against the saints and annihilate and overcome them, and they will be slaughtered, and the power of the holy people will be shattered. There's a number of prophecies in the Old and New Testament that suggest that basically the church, there are very few survivors. When those who remain, when Jesus says, and those who are alive and remain will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air, that terminology suggests even that, especially when you're coupled with the others, is that there's not a whole lot of survivors of true followers of Christ by the time he returns. And that's not over a slow period of time. There's just a sudden, and I see it. I mean, I see the verge, I see the buildup even in our civilization today, a growing hatred towards, we have a situation right now in our school, the school division near where I live, where a woman on the school division said the greatest evil in all humanity are white Christian men. That's the greatest evil. Now, granted, white people have done a lot of damage, men have done a lot of damage, and people have done a lot of damage in the name of Christianity, but nothing in comparison to what atheistic cultures have done, and that's, I've got a short article on that one that I've written. There's a guy, I think I referred to him, Rudolph Rommel, University of Hawaii. He starts documenting what atheistic regimes have done, and wow, it's like 100 times worse. Sorry, Sean, is it Sean? Yeah, did you have a question, Sean?
Yeah, can I see the first slide with the variables again?
The first slide with what?
The variables. Yeah, that one.
This one, or that one? Yeah. Okay. While he's looking at that, I think we better roll into the rape culture one. And by the way, all these, anyone who wants to get in touch with me afterwards by email, go to my website, contact Kirk, and ask, what is it? Tell me what you want, and I will give you PDFs of anything you saw, and you are free to use this any way you want. Even if you become a deconverter, God forbid, and decide to trash Kirk Durston. Kirk said, and then, okay, but hopefully that doesn't happen. So when we actually read various passages pertaining to rape, we observe that the ancient laws provided very strong deterrence or punishment for rape. That's the main idea. But let's get the worst one out here. This is the worst one, and you see it all the time. If somebody's going to talk about Christianity promoting rape and rape culture, this is the verse. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife, because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. Okay, that looks really bad on the face of it, so we're going to come back and especially look at within the context what it says here.
Why does it look bad? I mean, what he did is bad, but why does...
Well, they would. What's happened normally on, say, social media would say, look, a rapist likes a girl. All you have to do is rape her, and then she has to marry him. Now, that she has to marry him bit, that is not true. We're gonna take a look at. Plus, he gets away with this. I mean,
She wouldn't have had any other chances in her time.
We'll get to that. Yeah, you're getting ahead, but there's a lot more to this. But first of all, what is rape culture? When you hear people today talking about rape culture, this is just a secular definition. Emily Buchwald, Transforming a Rape Culture, is my source. It has two components to it. Number one, sexual assault occurs in a wide variety of ways, and it's normalized, or it's at least tolerated. For example, making jokes about rape, or the sexual objectification of women via online porn. This is what boggles my mind. Why feminists today who worry about rape culture aren't marching in the streets against online porn. Nothing degrades, nothing so, well, it's a huge problem as far as degrading women goes as online porn. I don't understand that, but sexual assault in a wide variety is tolerated. It can be even in the form of jokes, not even about rape, although that would definitely be an example, but just anything that disrespects women in the area of sexuality, anything at all that disrespects women. That would be number one. Number two component of it is blaming or shaming the victim for what happened. So the man might say, well, you shouldn't have been dressed that way, or you were, whatever. Or much more relevant today is that certain areas in the Middle East, if a woman is raped, she is the one that's punished because it's assumed, it's just automatically granted that she was the one who was acting in a sexual way, and the men could not help themselves in the way they went. And one that made international news was when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. The leader of the Taliban said to the women in Afghanistan, we want you to stay in your homes and dress the way proper good Muslim women would, because we cannot control our men, or something to that effect. I'm thinking, that is an insult to men, as if we see somebody with sketchy clothes and immediately we become like a berserk dog, that can't help himself. That's a very low view of men. And but anyways, that's my thing. A person has to take responsibility for what they do. I don't care what that woman looked like, or even if she somehow hinted that she would enjoy something. I am morally responsible for how I respond, and I can never blame anybody else for my sin. To confess your sin to God means you own it, you confess it, and you don't ever blame somebody else for it. And it's not just rape or inappropriate stuff. It happens all the time. Like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, but Billy Bob said such and such, and I just couldn't help responding. No, if it was wrong, you shouldn't have said it. And you had the ability to say no. So cultural complication here. Here it is. If you were asked to draft a set of laws for a very different culture, at a very different time and place in history, could you simply do what you thought best, or would you have to take into account the culture? Now, in one of my grad seminars, a seminar in graduate school is not just a 1-hour talk, it's a whole semester-long course, but you all sit down, small group of people, and you discuss papers. So at a grad seminar on ethics, my professor made a very important point. It never dawned on me before, because somebody said said, what should we do about this and that? And here's what maybe we could do in this, that. And somebody says, why don't we just, here's the ideal, here's the perfect world, why don't we just make those laws? And my prof said this. He says, if you draft a law, and he was regarded as an expert in Canada, interviewed on national TV for expert opinions. So he says, when you draft a law, and that law is seen as, and it's so good, it's seen as unreasonable in the sight of the society at large, they'll simply not comply. And then even worse, it'll produce disrespect for the law, okay? So a good law, the ethics prof says, and I understand this now, a good law will raise the bar as much as you dare, but it's not so high that the society will say, forget this. Simple example, where I live, if the speed limit is 100, sorry, that's kilometers per hour. If the speed limit is 62 miles per hour, everybody knows, nobody goes 62 miles per hour. You always have 12 miles per hour grace. So you can go 12 miles per hour over the speed limit, you're good. And everybody knows this, the government knows this, the police knows this. I've discussed it with police. Yeah, stay under the 12, you're good. We go after the big fish. Now, occasionally there's an exception and somebody gets a speeding ticket for going 2 miles an hour over the speed limit, but this is the reality of any culture you're going to make laws for. So let's follow up on this. We have a clue that we're going to come back to on this. First of all, there's two kinds of rape we see addressed in the law. The first was the victim was already engaged or spoken for or arranged to be married to someone. So they're already engaged. And if that was the case, then the other case was the victim was not engaged, spoken for, or arranged to be married. That was the two possibilities. So in the first case, if a woman was raped outside the city or in a place where if she cried out for help, no one would have heard her, the benefit of the doubt went to the woman. Now that is radical. The woman was assumed innocent if there was a case where she could have cried, but there was nobody to help or whatever. Even in the case of Tamar and firstborn son of King David. What? Who? Not Judah. King David. Not Absalom. It was Tamar's sister. His brother was Absalom. Tamar was Absalom's sister. But anyway, she got raped in a room where there was no possibility to cry out for help. But what did she do when she left the house of her half brother who had assaulted her? Tore her clothes, covered her head, and cried out in the street on the way home. Because what she was doing was making a statement that something awful had happened that she had no consent whatsoever for, and she wanted to make it very clear that she had distanced herself. But what happens if that was not a case? It's out in the country, out in the field somewhere. So nothing, and this is huge. This is not, the woman is not being blamed here. So it's not a rape culture in that case. The victim was presumed innocent, and the man was executed. Executed. So it's not like the Taliban here. Man rapes the woman, she gets executed or put into jail. No. He gets executed, she is regarded as innocent. That was the case for an engaged woman. But what if she was not engaged? And this is the one we already read. This 50 shekels of silver, he must marry her, and he cannot divorce her. So let's consider what, in that culture, what would be at play here. First of all, the rape victim's chances of marriage were greatly decreased, as Alexis pointed out. It's unfortunate, it's sad. It's not like they went away completely, but they're greatly decreased. And in Tamar's case, she was not only a strikingly beautiful woman, but she was also the daughter of the king. So you could not have a better candidate in the eyes of the general population of men as someone you might get interested in. But it says that after this event occurred, Tamar remained desolate, living with her brother, living in the house of her brother, which is very sad. But that was the culture of the day. There was a certain amount of shame. It's not that basically a man who married a woman who had been assaulted by that guy over there he's down at the bazaar, down at the farmer's market shopping, and that guy over there walks by, and this man over here, it was like he had my wife before I had her, and this is a shame on me. It's not a shame on the woman, it's a shame on me because that guy is walking around doing stuff. So typically in that culture, they wouldn't want to marry a woman who had been shamed that way. That's not justified, mind you, not justified at all. But keep in mind this law thing. How do we know that they did this at Mount Sinai? Because of the law on divorce. Jesus was asked, why did Moses allow divorce? It wasn't really Moses, it was God giving the command to Moses. And Jesus' next comment is telling. He said, because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning it has not been this way. God hates divorce, but because, and what's he talking about? He's talking about a culture that simply would not have, that had just blown off a law that says you can never divorce your wife. They would have simply done it anyways. So he raises the bar enough so that just try to limit the amount of divorces going on. But as you read the history of Israel in the New Testament, it becomes patently obvious that the majority of time, Israel did not even comply with the minimum standard God set for Israel in the law. And that's fine, because the law was fulfilling its purpose. It was showing we can't even measure up to a minimum standard here. And Romans brings that out. No flesh will be justified because of the law. It's either the law of Moses or the law in your heart. Everyone will be condemned. So number 2, as long as she remained unmarried, her father would be obligated to care for her for the remainder of her life. Now, the question is, the rapist was said, you have to marry that woman, but it does not follow that the woman has to marry him. In the book of Judges, we see that a man was willing to work for 10 pieces of silver per year. There's a number of points I'm making here, plus board and room. So let's say 10 pieces of silver would be equivalent to minimum wage today. In today's earning power, if $10 an hour is on the lower end of the wage scale, that man would require to pay the equivalent of just over $100,000 to the father, that 50 pieces of silver. Basically, everything you would make for pretty much 5 years. Pretty much 5 years worth of earnings. But what young guy's walking around with $100,000 in his pocket? So it was common in that day to sell yourself into indentured servitude for 6 years. You get paid up front, but now you're a slave for 6 years. At the end of that 6 years, with that for 6 years it was $125,000 roughly. You get $125,000 right up front. With that, you can buy a piece of land and start a farm, but you can't actually do that yet. That's being saved, hidden somewhere. You work off your 6 years, and in 6 years' time, you could start your own farm, which was a lot of people probably did that. That was built right into the law. So let's go back to point number 2 here. So he had to cough up $100,000. That way, if she refuses to marry the rapist, then the father would be compensated for having to care for his daughter for the remainder of his life. Her life. In the very real likelihood that the rapist could not pay, then he has to enter indentured servitude for about 6 years. So my point is this, is that it's not just a way to get the woman you want. Number 1, you're going to be a slave for 6 years. The payment is enormous. And number 2, she might not want to marry you. Now, why would I say the woman might have a choice? Well, in the case of Rebecca, we see that the bride price had already been paid, and now it's a choice, final choice, you want to go with this man or not, they ask her. And this is not only ancient Near East culture, this is Abraham's relatives here. So this is the culture from which the Israelis will announce. Now, you can't say, therefore, a woman always had a choice. That would be going too far. But we do see, hey, this was an option. Bride price has been paid, but she still could choose. You see, it's the man who had to marry the woman. It does not say the woman had to marry the man. Why would a woman possibly want to marry her rapist? Well, a lot of rape goes on between people who know each other and even friends. And it was the woman's choice. Maybe she actually liked the guy, but he went too far. She would be able to choose, but it's her choice. The woman had the option of marrying the man, but that would be her choice. The man would still have to pay the 100 thou, the 50 shekels of silver to her father, which would result in a massive deterrent to raping. But if she refused, he's now out 100 grand. He's got to sell himself into slavery for 6 years, and he gets no woman. So it was a very strong deterrent, and it's not like our culture thinks, like 50 cents. They think 50 shekels is 50 cents. No, it was an enormous price that the man would have to sell himself into slavery in order to pay. But given all this, I have a female colleague who's a bit of a Christian feminist, let's call her. And she reviewed all this, and she says that's her conclusions as well. But from her perspective as a Christian feminist, and this is a quote from her, with all of this, what it says, she says, powerlessness is a sensation felt by raped women, and gaining a sense of having power would help them heal. He took away her choice. The law gives it back to her, plus punishes the guy. So that's a response from a woman who basically agrees with this whole thing, what I've just presented. A woman on the feminist side of things. I don't entirely agree with her on everything. It's the old egalitarian complementarian situation. But we're good colleagues. I actually, she just retired, but I submit everything I write to her because I like to get reviews from not just people who think what I write is good, but I want to get reviews from people who's going to critically read this. So that's another thing to think about whenever you want to publish something. Get a review from somebody who doesn't agree. So definitely not rape culture. The Old Testament had no tolerance for sexual assault. The man was either executed or at minimum required to pay an enormous financial penalty. The woman was not required to marry the man unless it was her choice. It just simply doesn't say the woman had to marry the man. It's not there. It's not in the text. Only the man was obligated to do that if the woman was agreeable. The woman was certainly never blamed. There's no hint in the Old Testament that if a rape occurred, the woman was blamed. And the default was the woman is innocent, as we saw if it occurred in a field somewhere. She is innocent. Even if she was not innocent, the benefit of the doubt goes to the woman. Let's go to slavery in the Bible. Main idea here is the ancient biblical commands were the most advanced, actually, as far as how slaves and servants are being treated. So let's dive into this. When Jesus was asked, I already said this. This is where I bring out this point that God made, some of the commands given at Mount Sinai were not to define what the ultimate society looks like. In fact, we see that later on with murder. No, murder is a minimum standard, actually killing somebody. It's actually also murder to hate someone. So the bar is even higher than what he lays out at Mount Sinai. We see that with adultery. At Mount Sinai, you just couldn't actually sleep with your neighbor's wife. No, actually the bar is higher than that. You can't even think about sleeping with your neighbor's wife or any other woman you're not married to. So you see that the standards given at Mount Sinai were not the perfect thing. The only way you can perfectly carry out the will of God is to love him with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and allow him to totally change you by your Holy Spirit. That's when you start living in a way where to hate somebody is actually, you can't do it. It's just so awful. To lust after another person is just repugnant. And to divorce, well, when Patty, that's not even on the table. Now, there may be some times, and I'm aware of some times, where husbands are just go off the deep end. And even the Bible itself says there may be a time where a wife has to leave her husband. Like say he's beating her, her life is threatened, whatever. He's a pedophile and he might be assaulting the children. There is a time for that. I'm not saying the Bible does address that. So it's the same for slavery. Now, keep in mind, in a civilization where slavery and servitude was going to be practiced, the laws on slavery here in the Bible set a minimum standard that's actually much higher than otherwise found. Context from Mount Sinai, just 3 months earlier, they had lived under brutal conditions, heinous human rights, which pretty much weren't existent for them, slavery, floggings, killings. They had to kill all their male babies. That's the law. Kill your male children. This is a brutal, barbaric thing, and they're all slaves. That's it. That's the context here. So you got this massive starting point at Mount Sinai. Only a few months earlier, you got hundreds of thousands of slaves who normally could not be expected to treat other slaves different. They've been treated this way, they're going to treat their slaves that way if ever they get to be in a position someday where they have slaves. That's just the pattern that's set for them. They don't have to be cruel, they just don't respect their slaves or whatever. So when we hear of the word slave, we automatically think of the worst cases of what happened, let's say, on the cotton plantations of the southeastern USA in the 1800s. And that's what everybody automatically thinks today in our culture, slaves. Okay, that's what we're talking about. But that leads to a gross misconception of what happened. So Hebrew slaves, let's look at the slavery in detail now. So a Hebrew slave would enter a 6-year contract where the person was paid full in advance. In our culture, you get paid by the week as you work. Nope, you get paid for the next 6 years all in one shot right up front, which worked out in today's buying power to about $124,000. Not a huge wage in buying power, but back then, that could buy you a piece of land and start a farm. The person was obligated to work for their employer, although for most of you, probably $124,000 would still be better than poking the eye with a sharp stick, as they used to say where I grew up. The person was obligated to work for their employer for 6 years because they've already paid for your services, and if you wish to get your freedom back, you're going to have to refund that money, or at least the portion that you have not worked off yet. So if you're halfway through, you decide, I want out, you could actually pay back half that amount and you're free. But it was the slave's choice whether they continued after the 6 years, because some chose to do that. In fact, when you read what goes on in ancient Near East and ancient Roman culture, being a slave was actually seen as a career, as a way of security, of good housing. Yes?
Would that be even past like the year of Jubilee?
No, it doesn't even go past year number 7 in the that's why it's only 6 years.
No, but I mean like if they chose to stay.
Oh yeah, it's for life.
So even if like Jubilee came out, like they'd be like, we're staying anyway?
If they chose to. There's the idea where they get their ear pierced and have an earring in there so that it doesn't grow in again. That was called a bond slave back then. So, and it specifically says at the end of a term, if a slave loves their master, they love their work, they can decide if they want to stay for life, they can do it. And it's almost like a marriage commitment, but and slaves back then could be entrusted with a lot. They could become, like in the case of when Abraham sends, this is before the law, but you get an idea of slaves, sends the slave over to Haran to get a wife for his firstborn son. You don't let any Joe Blow do something like that. Like, I'm a little picky about who marries my kids. I'm not going to just send some slacker over there who's looking for a way to escape. And he equipped him with camel loads of wealth to give to the bride's father. Camel loads of wealth. If I want to escape as a slave, this is the time to do it. I have a far country with camel loads of wealth. Obviously, that slave was entrusted with enormous wealth and power and responsibility. We see other places in the scriptures they're entrusted with weapons. They actually help fight if there's a battle to come. We see that the slave of, when David becomes king, one of Saul's chief slaves also had slaves of his own, or servants. Slave is a poor word. Peter Williams of Tyndale House has a whole seminar on this, but we don't have as many words in English for this. We tend to use slave or servant, and it's kind of halfway between the two. Moving on along, it was a way of obtaining an enormous financial start in life. That was slavery as defined at Mount Sinai. Now, if a slave was mistreated, say you get paid your 124 thou, And on day 2 of your work, this master loses it and gives you a right hook to the jaw and knocks a tooth out, you are instantly free. And you do not have to pay back that 124 grand. So if you're a master, you want to get your money's worth out of this guy. You're not going to mistreat your slaves. Because there was other things they could do. There was different things, and you could be compensated by different amounts. Foreign slaves were different, though. When you captured a foreign slave, let's say Israel captured foreign slaves in battle and brought them back, that they were lifers.
Can I see that left side?
Which one? This one?
Yeah.
This one? This one?
Next one.
This one? So foreign slaves were lifers. Okay, we know.
Yeah. Oh well.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah. Oops. Oh, man. Okay. There you go. Foreign slaves were lifers. So let's take a look at foreign slaves and what the law had to say about them. They did not go free after 6 years, and I don't think they went free on the year of Jubilee, but it was still up to them whether they stayed or not, because there was this law given to Moses at Mount Sinai, which everybody conveniently forgets about. It says this: you shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place where he shall choose, in one of your towns, where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. Bottom line, can you imagine the cotton plantations in the southeastern U.S., where some of those plantations are treated pretty bad, and then the government made a law that said, by the way, you can escape if you want, and nobody's allowed to hand you back to your master. Well, if you were a bad master, that plantation would be emptied by tomorrow morning. It'd be gone. So this is what people forget, is that the decision as to whether to remain a slave or not, even for the foreign slaves, was in their mind, and they could look at their, as a career, is this what I want for a career? And do I want to rise within the ranks in my master's house? To be entrusted, like say Joseph, for example. Joseph was a slave in the house of Potiphar, but he arose to the rank of second in command in the house. The master entrusted everything to him except his wife. But all his wealth, the managing of his affairs, that's an enormous amount of, that's what people fight for today. They work hard and climb the corporate ladder. And Moses, of course, Joseph would have lived in luxury by then to be entrusted with that. So the above command essentially put the decision in the slave's hands. What we observe in the Old Testament, I'm sorry, Alexis, I'm just motoring on through, but you get a hold of me afterwards for any slides you want to photograph. I will back up, though, because that's only one thing here. Oh, where are we here? Yes, there you go. Take your shot. You're going to have to be quicker on the draw. Okay.
I just don't know when it's the end of the slide.
That's right. This old thumb can go off at any second. What we observe is in the Old Testament that slaves could acquire wealth, they could acquire their own servants, as well as be entrusted with weapons and great wealth and responsibility. And in the case of Abraham, they were also candidate for inheriting their entire master's estate. So it's quite a bit different. New Testament slaves are different, though. And okay, let's take a break before the final hour. It's Q&A. But I do want to finish the very first part of the Q&A. We're almost done here. Let's finish off the New Testament slaves. So let's get back here shortly, and that'll be our last session.